When it's cold outside, I want a warm drink. We can imagine this echoing throughout history. In the 18th century, that was so true. You can imagine today, we don't desire hot drinks the same way we might have 200 or 300 years ago because we live in these very climate-controlled conditions. Our houses are heated centrally. We go into our car and it's heated. We go to work, it's heated there. We don't need to stay warm like people did in the 18th century. They needed a warm drink to survive. So warm drinks were very, very common. It's been fascinating to study these warm drinks of the time period because they are the same but very different than what we have today. What are the classic warm drinks that we want to warm up with today? Well, so many people rely on their hot coffee in the morning or maybe hot tea, and in this kind of holiday season, hot chocolate. Those were all very popular in the 18th century. But they have other items that we only have just the tail end of today. Sometimes people might refer to a hot toddy or some other kind of warmed up drink that's a celebratory holiday drink. In the 18th century, those were so very, very common. And we can get an idea about why those are so common in that time period by thinking about coffee, tea, and chocolate today. That's popular all around the world. Whether it's hot weather or cold weather, these drinks are ubiquitous. Everyone enjoys coffee, tea, and chocolate. But the reality of coffee, tea, and chocolate in, say, England, Great Britain, France, and in the New World in the 18th century is that they're fairly new inventions. Those products start to become very, very popular from about 1650. All three of those, chocolate, coffee, and tea, and they grow in intense popularity even in the 18th century. Now, if they start at 1650, and they're really not around before that, what are people drinking in the morning? There's no such thing as coffee or tea or chocolate. It would be hard for us to imagine that today, wouldn't it? Well, what warm drink do they drink? We do the research and we find out that they're drinking things like warm beer or heated wine. Maybe something like heated milk or whey, which is a milk product. Most things don't die out in popularity right away, and that's why we see most of these interesting heated drink things kind of living on into the 18th century. Things with heated beer and brandy or heated up wine mixed with other kinds of products, whether it's milk or water, sugar, lemons, all these items are put together and they make all this interesting family of drinks in the 18th century, and they start to die out in the 19th century. And by the time you get to Prohibition in North America, they die out completely. We have hardly any vestiges of what was the classic, the only drink for breakfast, say in 1600, to completely dying out by the time we get to 1950. Many of these liquids are being drank as a singular item, just warm beer, just warm wine, say, or warm milk. But what's really interesting is when they start getting combined. Now, many of these things are getting combined into these complex mixtures for different reasons. You might mix, say, brandy and beer or wine and milk or these different things to start to make them a little bit more medicinal, or you might do that because the component parts are, let's say, not the best quality. We have different reasons, but they make all these very interesting drinks in our time period, and they have fascinating names that sort of evolve through time that are so fun to track down. And we've got a bunch of very, very fun sounding drinks that have all but disappeared. We've got names like Bumbo and Rumbo, or Hot Pot and Hot Punch. We've got Pearl or Bishop. We've got Collywobble, Flip, and Doctor. There are all these great names. Some of them are, let's say, from the lower strata, where they're kind of nicknames for drinks. And I think that so many of these names are also very local, and the drink itself might be different from place to place. So the ingredients might change, or even the way it was created, but the name kind of is so fun that it moves from place to place. Some have a great name, and the drink still stays with us. Its name has changed. So we have something like Six and Tips, which is actually just a Boilermaker.
Punch is a beverage that is referenced throughout the 18th century, and you see it a lot. People have punch for parties. They have enormous punch bowls. They have tiny little punch bowls. You see flip being referenced as punch for a sliver of time there in the 18th century. So this could be considered either one. The big difference is that punch was kind of a higher class drink, and flip was a low class sailor drink, although they're using the same ingredients. So the recipe is saying to make either one, do this. And it doesn't give you quantities. So we're just taking the ingredients and we're gonna make it to taste just like they would have been in the time period. We're gonna start by cutting up some citrus fruit. We're gonna use some lemons and some limes, and they don't give us any quantities. I like a little bit more lemon than I like lime, so that's the direction we're gonna go. Before we even do that, we're gonna get some water to boil over on the fire. And we're just gonna use the juice of these. We're gonna add rum, sugar, and we're gonna pull it all together so it tastes the way we want it to, and it's that simple. If you want to experience one of the most popular drinks of the time period, especially over this holiday season, you don't wanna miss this one. Some of this is gonna be a little different or a little unusual because I'm not making this grand bowl of punch. I'm just making enough for me to try. I'm kinda going to do it in little bits while it's over the fire. I'll squeeze the lemons in, I'll squeeze the limes in, and I want to put the sugar in when the water's hot so it gets nice and distributed throughout. It's done, and you might be sitting at home thinking, that's just hot lemonade with some rum poured in, and that's exactly what it is. But let's see what it tastes like. Ooh, that's really good. It's like a sweet tea. The citrus really comes through, and it's not like super sweet, it's just enough to tame the tankiness of those lemons and limes. The rum comes through, but it's not too strong. It's perfect. I would sit by a campfire and drink this and really enjoy it. Sometimes they would call this a combination of opposites. So water to make it cool, liquor to make it hot, lemons or citrus to make it sour, and sugar to make it sweet. And it all rounds out just perfectly.
Many of these beverages start out as medicinal. They are very concerned with staying healthy, and most of their medicine was really food-based kind of medicines. Sometimes they were, typical medicines that we might have today. We kind of classify them as poisons. So they would try to fix that with certain kinds of drinks in the time period. And they would mix a lot of beer and eggs and milk and kind of brandy. And brandy was very much considered medicinal, especially early on. A lot of things start out as medicine and become sort of recreational later on. And that's so true with many of these drinks. They start out as medicine. You're ill, maybe you should be drinking this, and oh, I start to like this. And then pretty soon you're drinking it for pleasure instead of just for medicine. There's an interesting anecdote or story in the 18th century about a man who stops at an inn and he is ill. He probably has just a cold or something. He decides that he is medicinally going to drink a hot punch. He has the innkeeper prepare a hot punch and bring it up to his bedside, and he falls asleep instantly before he drinks it. And the person who's sharing the room with him, or in fact sharing the bed with him, which happens in the 18th century, he drinks the entire hot punch down, and then he goes to bed too. The other man who ordered it wakes up, and he feels much better in the morning. He looks over at the table, he sees the glass empty for his hot punch, and he says, boy, I knew that medicine was just what I needed. Many of these drinks also have a very specific connection to a class of people. So middle and higher class people, they're going to drink a punch, a warm punch usually in the wintertime, and that's going to have brandy and water and sugar and lemons, and maybe a few other components, maybe a little spicing in there too, or a mulled wine or a spiced wine. But lower class people, especially sailors, they're going to be drinking a flip or possibly something like eggnog. You see a lot of sailors drinking eggnog, which is seemingly very similar to an alcoholic eggnog of today. You can see this a lot in, say, court records of the time period. People that get drunk and get in trouble with the law, they talk about what they were drinking, and they were usually these kind of lower class drinks like flip or a simple hot pot. And sometimes we'll see recipes in the time period and they'll say, well, you can make a hot punch, and they'll give you the ingredients, and usually it's, you know, something probably like a very expensive brandy in that. And if you're making flip, it's a very inexpensive, something like rum or gin that would be mixed with it, something that would be less expensive in the time period.
Eggnog is one of the mysteries of our time period. During this research, I've researched eggnog in the past, years ago. You can find the references. I have never found a recipe. I did find one reference where there were some folks that were traveling in the woods and they'd been robbed of their supplies for eggnog, and they listed them. So I have something to go off of here. And it's funny because you really want to nail this one, because this is a drink that we drink now. This is a festive drink. There are probably cartons of eggnogs in refrigerators all across this country right now. We're in December. But we just kind of have to take what we know and make it happen. And I know this, it's not like what we think of today. It's not a thick, almost melted ice cream custard. Oh, that's not what we're gonna make today. But we are gonna make one of the best eggnogs that I've ever had. Now, most of this video has been based off of hot drinks from the time period. And with eggnog, you can make that decision. People do drink this hot. You can make this hot. You can also make an uncooked version, which is going to be a lot better for folks that are at reenacting events or camping. If you want to take eggnog with you, it's going to work. And we're going to do a raw eggnog recipe today. You can cook this into a custard if you would like to, but all we're going to need is eggs, sugar, some what they call new milk, which is essentially half and half, and your alcohol of choice. We see rum and we see brandy used most in the time period. I'm going to use brandy because that's what I like best. We're just going to start by putting 3 whole eggs into our large bowl here. Now, if you wanted this to be even thicker, creamier, you could separate the yolks from the whites. But from what I can tell from historical references, it seems like they're just using whole eggs. After we get those eggs into our bowl, we're just going to take a whisk and get those whisked up a little bit. And then I got about 2 cups of our half and half. And I didn't buy half and half. I got milk and I got cream because I wanted it to be a little bit thicker than half and half. So that's what I'm using. After you pour that in, just go ahead and stir that up. And then what we're gonna do is get some sugar in there to start with. But keep stirring until you get a little bit of yellow from those yolks all the way through your cream. You wanna make sure it's mixed up really well. And now I've just got a tablespoon here, and I'm gonna put a couple of scoops of sugar in there and get that stirred up. And we're just gonna start there. I don't know if that's where we're gonna end. While I'm mixing that up, I'm going to add some brandy. I probably just added 3, maybe 4 ounces. We don't want that sugar to just settle at the bottom, so we're really going to get it stirred up in here. Now, if you were going to make this a hot version of this drink, you would just get your cream and your milk into your saucepan, and you would start to simmer that, stirring it the whole time so it doesn't burn until it starts to reduce a little bit. And a lot of people will use the trick that if you pull your wooden spoon out and you run your finger across it and the line stays, then it's ready to go. After that, you're gonna have to do the same sort of tricks that we did with the buttered beer as far as tempering it to your eggs, but you'll get it all mixed together. And then everything else is the same as what we're doing now. Our eggnog is finished. It was the simplest recipe of the day, and I ended up adding a few more tablespoons of sugar. It just depends on how much brandy you put in, and I like mine fairly brandy heavy. All right, let's see what it, wait a second here. All right. Almost forgot. Now we're ready to try this. That's a whole lot of nutmeg. Wow. Okay, that's my favorite eggnog. It's delicious. You should try it at home.
The research on this can be very difficult in that we have very few specific recipes, except for the occasional flip or punch recipes. So because punch was a little bit higher class kind of a drink, we'll find multiple punch recipes, sometimes with milk and other items, but the punch recipes all kind of run in the same line. You'll find that in cookbooks, but most of these other lower class drinks, we only have simple descriptions of them, and they just kind of name the ingredients, maybe in their importance or possibly in order of their quantities, but more likely sort of the importance of them. And very interesting to see that they are very creative. There are times when there are components that they don't have available to them, like specifically, maybe you don't have a good brandy. And you'll have these layers of alcohol that you will choose as substitutes. So you might go from a brandy that would be great to a lower class brandy. Then you might go to, say, a rum, and then whiskey would be the bottom one. And it really depends on where you're at as to what kind of item that you will substitute into your drink. So where are people drinking these warm drinks in the wintertime? It's normal that people would drink these things for breakfast, and they might do this in their very own home. These are prepared in a standard kitchen. There's no incredibly hard to find ingredients, and they're usually very, very simple preparations. But this is also the time when we have a lot of, say, festivity and celebration going on. In the wintertime is the time when people have the time, because it's cold outside, they're not doing as much work outside, they have time to get together in groups. And we do see that kind of reflected in diaries of the time period, when wintertime is the time for people to get together, to find a warm sitting room or some other place in a home right by the big fireplace, and they sit around and they drink those warm drinks. And we see that reflected in so many of these writings that we look at. And they also get together in these classic taverns and coffee houses of the time period, where everybody gets together. It's a time for community and connecting with other people in your area and getting together to drink these warm drinks because you need them to feel better. This is equally true or more so for soldiers and sailors of the time period. Now, their ingredients are probably much lower quality, and maybe they don't have as much, but they are out in the weather. It's dark outside, and they're going to huddle around that fire, and they're going to stay warm. There's multiple references to a particular sailing trip when it was very cold outside, and they were under duress with the lack of supplies and few people to get themselves through a storm, and they created a hot punch for the sailors to drink. And there's even kind of references that these warm alcoholic drinks were more important to people than warm clothing or other items. I thought that was kind of odd. Today, we would definitely go for give me the Arctic coat before the hot toddy drink. But in the time period, maybe not so much. Here's a writing from the time period that gives us a little bit of idea about what the author thought about how important these hot alcoholic drinks specifically were to people, especially poor people. He says, "Now this is the sure deplorable case of all poor men and their families, if they have any, and all for the want of a little liquor to cheer them up and to put life in their chilly veins on a cold frosty morning or a hazy windy day when a noggin of hot punch would be 10 times more comfortable to their hearts and bellies than another coat or pea jacket would be to their backs, when the stinking breezes and sprays from the sea will make a man sick to death, and without he has liquor to comfort him, he must die." Another one of these early warmed up drinks is one that at least sounds good, and that is hot buttered ale or hot buttered beer. And these are both early and kind of classic drinks of this probably 17th century time period, where we do include some oil, some hot butter, some eggs in there. We have ale or beer, and there's a big difference for ale and beer in our 17th and 18th century time period. Ale tends to be not hopped at all, or very lightly hopped. And then beer classically has a good amount of hops in it. And hops comes in a lot more in the 17th and especially in the 18th century. Hops helps that beer stay good for a long period of time. And ales can go bad because the hops aren't there to preserve that alcoholic beverage. But we can see them being used in this kind of warming up and especially maybe a breakfast kind of drink where we have the butter, we have the eggs, we have the ale here, and it creates this mixture. In the 20th century, we've heard about hot buttered rum, but I have not really found a good connection with hot buttered rum, at least specifically talked about in the 18th century.
This is one of the earliest recipes that we're talking about in this particular video. Our references come from the 1680s. This was likely being drank way before then. So we're talking about before coffee and chocolate and tea were normalized in households, people were likely drinking this quite often, and it's called hot buttered ale. So the first thing we're gonna do is take our ale and we're gonna get it on the fire with a little bit of butter and some sugar, and we're just gonna get it to boil. We don't need to go crazy with this. As soon as you see it start to bubble, simmer a little bit, we're gonna take it off. Then we're gonna separate egg whites from yolks. For this one, with the amount of beer that I have, which is a pint, I'm just gonna use 3 egg yolks. We're gonna separate those. We're gonna go ahead and get the yolks broken up and stirred together. And then slowly we will add our hot mixture to our eggs so that we're not cooking the eggs. And after we even bring it off the fire, we're gonna let it cool before we even do that. Look at this drink. That's just beautiful. It looks like something that you'd see coming out of a coffee cafe. It's really pretty. As far as tempering the eggs, what I did was I got my egg yolks into a container and I put just a little bit of the hot beer into another bowl so it would start to cool down. And once it was about just a little warmer than my body temperature, I put the eggs in, I stirred that up, and then you want to take something like a big mug if you have one, or a saucepan or something else, but you just kind of want to take the hot liquid and the new mixture and go back and forth, and that's going to temper it. It's also going to give you the added benefit of getting a nice kind of froth going on. This looks fantastic. It smells surprisingly good, kind of sweet, buttery with a deeper note that you're getting from that ale. I don't drink a whole lot of drinks with egg yolks in them, but I do from time to time, so I don't think it's going to be surprising. Let's give it a shot. Whoa, okay. There's almost like a butterscotch thing going on there. This is really, really good. This is something that people would be glad to come over as guests, sit around your fire, get nice and warm, huddle together for some conversation, and you could just drink this all night long. It'd be wonderful.
Now, lest we leave coffee and tea all by themselves over on the side here, kind of separating them from these warm drinks, there is a little kind of overlap. And we see more than one reference to the idea of ladies probably drinking in a tea house or in a coffee house, and the reference to adding to their drink French cream, which was of course a euphemism in the time period for brandy. So even these coffee and tea products were mixed in an alcoholic way in our time period. The research can be fun, but very, very challenging on these drinks, and especially the names, because there's a constant evolution of the drinks themselves and the names for them. So as we look in the records, we can kind of see the names come into popularity and then be popular and then disappear 50 or 60 years later. We can see in court cases that Flip is mentioned in these particular time frames, and then after, Flip kind of disappears. And the drink itself might actually continue to stay popular or even evolve a little bit and completely change its name. You can't do a word search on the drink for doctor because you will find a million references for regular doctors, and you don't know when they're talking about the drink or you're talking about the person. There's a term we still use today, a hot toddy, meaning a warm alcoholic drink. And that term itself is one that evolved entirely in the 18th century. At the beginning part, it was a very specific kind of alcoholic beverage from Southeast Asia, from particular kinds of tree sap that they would turn into an alcoholic beverage. And then by the time we get to the late 18th century, early 19th century, it's a term basically for a generic hot alcoholic drink like the term we would use it today. So some of these terms change a great deal through this 18th century time period. In many of the recipes, we have a posset in our time period, and possets were a medicinal drink with wine and milk that would curdle, and you would kind of eat it with a spoon and you would drink it at the same time. One of these early drinks also is the mulled wine or burnt wine, which is wine that's heated and it's got lots of spices in the time period. So this was probably one of the more expensive drinks. And again, it's one of those that's going out of favor in the 18th century. It's probably much more common in the 17th century, which you can see these holdovers for these drinks as we move through time. We have to take a lot of these directions or recipes with a grain of salt and adjust them for their location. If you're in North America, brandy's not as popular, and you'll find rum substituted and whiskey substituted depending on exactly where you're at. We have the drink called Calabogus, which is specifically North American, and it uses whiskey and spruce beer, again something very North American, along with maple sugar or maple syrup to make that drink up. And it's almost a specific North American drink. You can see how this is an adjustment for a much more British recipe that would use regular beer and brandy and regular sugar instead of those ingredients. Isn't it interesting, our choices today in cold weather for our hot drinks? Well, we've got tea, we've got coffee mostly, and maybe the occasional hot chocolate. And in the 18th century, you have dozens and dozens of combinations and classic hot drinks that are all but disappeared today. They're using ingredients like whiskey and rum and brandy and ale and beer and eggs and milk and sugar and lemons. All of these kinds of things and all these wonderful, complex, and probably very tasty combinations, and they are all but gone today.